and welcome to Adventures in Relationship, a psychoeducational show about healthy relationships for adults with complex trauma. I'm Amy Gordon, an individual and couples psychotherapist working on unceded Tiwa land in Albuquerque, New Mexico. I also offer virtual therapy, so reach out if you'd like to work with me individually or as a couple. Okay, so you've probably heard that conflict is a normal part of any healthy relationship, or maybe that conflict is a necessary component of intimacy. And while that's mostly true, I don't fully agree with this sentiment. And quite frankly, these statements sometimes feel shameful to folks who find conflict difficult. So today, I want to help adults with complex trauma understand their conflict avoidance and speak to the power of developing some fundamental conflict management skills and not probably what you assume I'm going to share. There are a lot of clinical recommendations and messages out there that can essentially reinforce complex trauma by shaming conflict avoidance through a cognitive behavioral lens of simply changing your thinking and behavior to develop skills to better manage interpersonal tension. And that's not what I'm going to do. What I want to do is help you navigate the emotional flashbacks that make conflict challenging for you. We'll break that down. To be clear, the reason why so many folks avoid conflict is because their body sends them into an emotional flashback state when conflict arises. What I want to do is meet you where the rubber hits the road in that emotional flashback and focus less on the skills of conflict management, at least for this episode. Um, Conflict avoidance, despite the shame, really isn't a flaw or a failure of character. It doesn't mean that you're fucked up. For many adults with CPTSD, it's evidence of a nervous system that learned how to survive relational danger. So if you avoid conflict, it's because your system learned something early on, that conflict was unpredictable or uncontained, that disagreements never lead to repair, and that expressing yourself could cost you safety, attachment, stability, and so on. I want to talk about conflict avoidance through a CPTSD lens and specifically explain the role of emotional flashbacks in making conflict feel unbearable to so many of us. An emotional flashback is a sudden shift into an emotional state that reflects the emotional experience of a traumatic event or recurring traumatic dynamic. So I'll say that one more time. An emotional flashback is a sudden shift into an emotional or felt state, somatic state that reflects or reverberates a previous emotional experience, or more likely, a recurrent traumatic dynamic. This term differs from the common use of the word flashback in that the re experiencing is without a visual memory attached. So there's no clear image or story to the sensations that are coming up in the body. There's also, confusingly, no sense of then versus now for that reason, just a flood of feeling. And that can be shame, anxiety, panic, shutdown, collapse. It can bring up fawning, fighting, fleeing, all of that. So basically, in an emotional flashback, your body believes that the past is happening now. And it's hard to really make sense in the mind of what's going on. So for adults with CPTSD, conflict is one of the most common triggers of emotional flashbacks, as I mentioned. And for adults with complex trauma, conflict is rarely a simple experience. It's not just a disagreement in the present moment. It's an emotional flashback into moments where speaking up led to punishment, sometimes very severe. Needs led to ridicule, disagreement escalated unpredictably, and repair never came. So when conflict appears in adulthood, our hyper aroused nervous systems, or even hypo, if we go into collapse, nervous systems don't accurately assess a current situation. They launch into an emergency response because we're experiencing a memory without the awareness that we're reacting to events from the past. During an emotional flashback, our access to higher cortical areas of the brain are limited. So language access narrows, time collapses, and the body prepares for danger. You might feel suddenly small and overwhelmed. You might experience, like I mentioned before, the 4 Fs and 5 Fs, whatever you want to call them. Um, and this is why conflict can feel disproportionately intense for folks with complex trauma. You're responding to the cumulative weight of unresolved past conflict. Traditional therapy in the US often overlooks the complexity of the experiences of adults with complex PTSD who seek therapy partially because they struggle with conflict. Traditional therapy in the US often overlooks the complexity of the experiences of adults with complex PTSD who seek therapy partially because they struggle with conflict. But most clinicians overlook the importance of exploring what's happening with clients' emotional flashbacks, focusing instead on enhancing communication skills that fly right the fuck out the window as soon as a real life conflict scenario presents itself. And that's as the result of those higher cortical areas of the brain being quote unquote offline when we get highly activated. So those clients might be labeled or seen as resistant. Ugh. When clinicians overlook the power of emotional flashbacks and conflict avoidance, they target behavior instead of state. But it's state that precedes behavior, not the other way around. Most clinicians in the US have zero training in complex trauma and rely on the basics that the institutions taught them to support clients in being more assertive, challenging avoidant cognitions, or pushing through discomfort, a potentially harmful suggestion, likely harmful suggestion, really. But emotional flashbacks are not cognitive distortions, they're nervous system activations. Asking someone to confront conflict while in an emotional flashback is like telling someone to tie their hands behind their back and then jump in and swim. When these approaches fail, as they do, clients internalize the blame. They might think, like, I'm bad at therapy, or therapy doesn't work for me, or I should be over this by now. Something must be really wrong with me. But what's rarely named is this: they're being impossibly tasked to override an emotional flashback instead of being assisted in learning how to alleviate it. And what's really scary is that some therapeutic models rely on exposure, the idea that repeated confrontation with something aversive reduces fear. But for CPTSD, exposure without regulation often deepens emotional flashbacks because it forces a person into a dissociative state just to cope with the feelings that arise with confrontation or exposure. Instead of learning, I survived, the nervous system learns, I was overwhelmed again. CPTSD informed work understands that emotional flashbacks drive avoidance and that safety needs to be established before a person can access their aligned expression. As well, intentional pacing mitigates re traumatization. The goal isn't to eliminate fear. The goal is to reduce the intensity and duration of emotional flashbacks so that communication becomes possible. So here are those tips that I promised for exiting emotional flashback states before addressing conflict itself. First, practice naming what's happening by saying something like, this is an emotional flashback, or an emotional flashback is happening. Witnessing your own experience and engaging some objectivity helps in maintaining a sense of orientation. Second, ground in the present moment. Name where you are, who you're with, maybe some sensory awareness, like what can you experience with your 5 senses right now? What's in your direct environment? Remember to breathe. Allow your body to move. Grounding is a great way to expedite regulation. Third, identify just a few key points in advance. This helps to bypass the challenges of accessing language during conflict. But don't force yourself to follow a complicated script. Just think your goal, like I want to come out of this feeling closer with this person, and maybe the point that you want to make. Just try to keep a couple of anchors in mind. And lastly, track successful repair afterward. This helps the nervous system update and begin to operate from a place of greater safety, reinforcing the belief that conflict doesn't always lead to danger. For many adults with CPTSD, conflict historically led to unresolved rupture. But when conflict includes repair, emotional flashbacks gradually diminish. The nervous system learns something new, that disagreement can happen and connection can remain. This learning happens slowly through repetition and through safety. So, really monitor the things that make you feel safe, the people who make you feel safe. Notice where you do and don't feel safe, and be patient with yourself. As I wrap this up, I want to remind you that if you avoid conflict, you're not broken. You're navigating emotional flashbacks with the tools or lack thereof that you've been given. Healing is not about forcing courage, it's about reducing threat. When emotional flashbacks soften, conflict stops feeling like a matter for survival response activation. And only then does expression become possible at your pace, in your body, with support. And that's the work. Just a reminder to please get professional help locally or online if you're struggling. I'm a therapist, but I'm not your therapist, and this isn't therapy. So please don't rely on podcasts or webcasts as your primary mental health support, and take good care of yourself and your partner if you're committed. Know that you don't have to abandon yourself to do so. I really appreciate you taking the time to listen to this podcast today. My mission is to help adults with complex trauma find emotional freedom and learn how to thrive in relationships. So if you can take a moment to follow, rate, or share this episode, it's immensely helpful. Thank you for watching or listening. Until next time.